Great, Jan. Thank you. Thank you very much for the introduction. I hope you can indeed find my slides. It's safer if somebody else does it. Maybe you can make it a little bit bigger for the audience. It's a pleasure to be here today with you and many good old friends and colleagues like Ulrich and Jorgo. Um, so let me just quickly go a little bit on how we see hydrogen in the global context actually, and I'm saying that because I was announced as being indeed connected to Clingendael International Energy Program, but I have several hats on also kind of global hydrogen hats as a chair of IPHE and hydrogen advisor to IEA and Gazuni. Next slide, please. But I want to start with this really the global context. So yes, I know we're talking about Europe, but as Europe, we also need to take into account the global context. So what is really amazing from our point of view is that like last year, despite the COVID crisis and despite the economic crisis that also followed the COVID, that actually the global momentum for hydrogen has actually increased instead of what many people feared, that it would actually slow down. But we have seen the contrary. We've seen actually that both private companies and also countries have actually stepped up their efforts in clean hydrogen. Amount of countries have launched strategies, and not only have they launched nice policy papers and strategies, but they also have, and I'm sure Ulrich will say much more about that, have also made really impressive announcement of public funding, commitments for public funding. I mean, this on this slide you see here a number of 25 billion, but it's probably already outdated. That's probably already more. But only in Germany and France together, we are talking in Europe about 16 billion euros, and also other countries outside of Europe, like Chile, Canada, Australia, and of course earlier already Japan and Korea. So there's really a global momentum going on, and actually the first trade corridors, like between Japan and Australia, we're reading regularly about that in the newspapers, are actually starting to develop. Next slide, please. So so I want people to take into account that yes, this is a big thing, going to be a big thing in Europe, developing to be a big thing, but it's also global, and we need to take that global context into account. And the reason is really very simple, and I think that probably the previous presentation has already touched upon it. That of course you see now that globally speaking, there is a lot of potential in many countries, particularly where you can, for green hydrogen, where you can massively produce much more renewable energy than you would ever need in your own country. And for me, the outstanding outstanding example is Chile, where they have not only launched a strategy, but they have calculated with the help of McKinsey and others that the potential in a country like Chile for renewable energy production is 70 times, you heard it correctly, 70, what they would ever need for their own decarbonization. So if you can produce so much renewable energy very cheaply, and they can in Chile, and a country like Chile with a lot of sun and also a lot of wind, by the way. So suddenly, if you can produce that so cheaply, and you can start thinking about and a technology developing to ship that, to turn it into green hydrogen and then ship it around the world, a completely new world is basically opening up. And I think we need to take that into account in not only take it into account in Europe, but also already foresee that we can also not only produce hydrogen, green and blue hydrogen, as has been discussed before, but in domestically in Europe, but we can also start to import that from other parts of the world. It's what they call, in Australia, they call it like that. You know, Australia is now the largest exporter of LNG, of gas, liquefied gas, and they say in the future they will be the biggest exporter of green hydrogen. So they call it, we are going to ship sunshine around the world. This is the future. Next slide, please. Now, I already talked about the strategies, the different strategies that have been launched, and it's kind of interesting to, as the World Energy Council has done, to analyze what those strategies actually are saying. And they're saying basically, and that's kind of the, if you will, the acknowledgement that has come in the last couple of years, that if we start discussing and thinking about net zero emissions ultimately in 2050, completely decarbonizing our economy, how are you going to do it? How are you going to decarbonize heavy duty transportation, industry? How are you going to have long-term storage of energy? And this is where clean hydrogen has come in, that we discovered, many people discovered around the world, that you will need clean hydrogen, not as the only solution, but as the missing link to decarbonize these hard to abate sectors. And not surprisingly, you see in the strategies a lot of attention for industry and transportation as the key issues. But again, also, and that's good to keep in mind, it's not only decarbonization story, it is also a story, as I said, of some countries that are seeing a huge potential to develop basically economics in an export sector on the back of that, like Chile, like Australia, and many others to follow. Next slide, please. It's a story about green hydrogen from renewable energy, as I said, but it's not the only thing. We also will also see, only also because of the volumes that will be required, blue hydrogen, so from fossil fuel, but then of course decarbonized with carbon capture and storage. And as was mentioned in the earlier presentation, also, why not pyrolysis if we can make it on a large scale really cost effective? Why not? That could also add, and not mentioned here on the slide. Oh yeah, here I think it's mentioned on nuclear, Russia. But Russia is not the only one that's looking at nuclear hydrogen from nuclear. Also in the US, in Canada, other countries are looking at, France of course, are looking at nuclear to produce decarbonized hydrogen. Next slide, please. Now, basically, we talked about it. We've seen a lot of strategies being launched, but more is coming, and including Russia, China, Morocco, others will follow. Next slide, please. So there's a huge momentum. That's what I want to say. And the driver is the net zero emissions targets that not only countries but also companies have started to introduce. And I mean, for me, and Ulrich can tell us much more about it, but for me, like, the eye opener was ThyssenKrupp. I mean, the biggest steel company in Germany, saying that they want to be, and also one of the biggest emitters in Germany, saying they want to be carbon neutral in 2050. Imagine what that means. Imagine what that means, the vision of going to produce on a large scale steel without CO2 emissions. It means a tremendous demand for clean hydrogen going forward. As I said, we were seeing already countries positioning themselves and saying, listen, if we need so much clean hydrogen that we will need massive imports. Japan, Korea have said that to the world already. This is why Australia and others are jumping on this as, you know, we can provide you with this. But also Germany, in their strategy, they are counting on a lot of imports, as Ulrich will explain much better than I do, and even the Netherlands. And those things are also connected, because the Netherlands, basically a lot of the imports from Germany will come through the Netherlands, through the port of Rotterdam, since the port of Rotterdam is the most important port for North Rhine-Westphalia. So you see a kind of a new game, if you will, developing of net importing country, net exporting country, and that could have all the issues also on geopolitics. I will not get into that right now. That's maybe for the discussion. It's an emerging debate. Next slide, please. Sorry, you have to click a lot of times here. This is a complicated slide, as always when you have the IEA. IEA makes very complicated slides, and I'm always struggling with it, but I'm happy I can ask you to do it now. Just keep on clicking. The main message here is just keep on clicking, Jan. It's a very complicated slide, but the main message really here is calculation from the IEA, and this is something that still a lot of people do. I keep stressing this always, that yes, you have net zero emissions 2050 that everybody is, you know, getting ready to work towards, but we don't sometimes underestimate that in order to be able to get to 2050, we need so much scaling up that this scaling up needs to happen now. So the 2050 story is not, many people think that, yeah, but hydrogen, yeah, in 2050 it will play a role, but it doesn't mean we have to do something now. No, if hydrogen will have to play that role in 2050, the lead times of investment and of scaling up are so large that we have to do a lot of things right now. Like you see here, in 2030, we already need a huge 40 megatons on a global scale. IEA has calculated this, and you can discuss the numbers. It's not important. The important thing is we need to do a hell of a lot of investment right now in the next 10 years in order to have any chance in 2050 to reach that net zero emissions, including for hydrogen. Next slide, please. So the good news for Europe, though, I started with the global picture, but I always love to tune into the Asian webinars. Why? Because it makes you, give you a different view of how the rest of the world sees Europe. And this was one of the most fascinating ones where the many Asian participants were actually criticizing each other and were saying, okay, wonderful that Japan and South Korea have started with this hydrogen story, but actually you're doing way less than what Europe is doing. So if you look at the hydrogen strategy of Europe, tremendously ambitious, and I'm very grateful for that. I applaud that. And much more ambitious actually than what Japan and Korea are doing on that scale. Of course, the only problem is, that's why I put that on the slide, that we need to really make it happen. The execution of the strategy is going to be key. So for us, for Europe, I think the plans are there, but now it is really implementation. That should be the biggest priority. Make it happen on the ground. Next slide, please. I can go much quicker now. Talking about my home country, the Netherlands, we also have an ambitious strategy, very high ambition for green hydrogen, apart from blue hydrogen as well, but I'm not talking about that in this slide. 3 to 4 gigawatt, which is basically 10% of the EU target. So that's a lot, but I think it's possible because there are a lot of plans in Europe, in the Netherlands, which are very promising. One of them being a project you may have heard of, North H2, which is basically already North H2 is a project of for green hydrogen of Gasunie, but also Shell, RWE has entered this international consortium, and Equinor, and that can be really a game-changing project for the entire Europe, the northwestern part of Europe, I should say, including Germany, because they want to have also green hydrogen for German industry. That's their plan. Next slide, please. Costs, of course, are still high, but we need to bring that down by the scaling up. Scaling up is going to be critical for bringing down the cost of the green hydrogen. So there, basically, you can see that the whole project and the ideas are that the northwestern European market can be incredibly promising to start the scaling up in basically in Europe. The next slide, please. But we do need infrastructure for that. And that's the point that I want to stress a lot. Part of what I call implementation is making real concrete projects of industry really happen in practice, but also developing the infrastructure. Now, the good news is for Europe, and Jan, I'm telling you, and I'm telling all the colleagues that, again, this is something you hear a lot from the Asians. The Asians are saying, wow, Europe is so lucky because they have so much gas infrastructure. They can connect all the countries by basically repurposing those gas pipelines to dedicated hydrogen pipelines. So we can connect, and if we have this plan, which has been put on the table by infrastructure companies last summer, we can develop this starting in Northwestern Europe and other parts, and then basically connect everything over time in the next 15 years by repurposing those gas pipelines. Because as the use of gas will be phased out gradually, we can use those gas pipelines. And in the Netherlands, we are phasing out quite rapidly. So we are in these circumstances in the Netherlands that we can actually have huge capacity of gas pipelines already available in the next 10 years. So this is not kind of a music of the future. This is music of now. Next slide, please. And ultimately, we made a lot of calculations about, again, another huge example, comparative advantage of Europe is the huge offshore wind capacity that we have. If you compare it at a global scale, there is no basin in the world so well placed for wind offshore as the North Sea, because it's relatively undeep. Huge capacity factors for wind. So we're talking about, if we made the calculations for the North Sea, we're talking for the next decades, a potential of probably 180 gigawatts. And there's no way that we're going to use this 180 gigawatt only for greening of the power mix. At a certain moment, you're done. The power mix is all renewables, or more or less all new renewables. And then how can you use that potential? Well, you can use it by making green hydrogen. And even we are eyeballing, like Denmark, artificial islands in the North Sea, where you have huge offshore electrolysis capacity, and you will use the gas pipelines that you no longer use for gas production. You can use that to bring this green hydrogen on land. That's kind of the longer term perspective that we have for the North Sea. Next slide, please. I'll probably be finished by now. Yes. So to wrap it up, I think it's obvious that the clean hydrogen is going to be really reshaping the markets by now, and you can debate endlessly how much hydrogen is going to be, and I find those discussions, to be honest, not that interesting, because we don't know. There's so many uncertainties in the technology. How fast will the cost come down, etc., etc. But we do know one thing: it's indispensable. And if it's indispensable for at least some part of the mix, is it 10%, 15%? If you go to the minimum, you still need a huge investment on a global scale to make that happen. Now, the good news is, again, EU is ahead in this race. I call it the space race, not me, it's not my words. This is the word that I picked up from Asia. They call it the new space race, but EU has huge opportunities there. But we need to make the supply work. The demand, we need to mobilize it, but then the supply needs to come. But we really need to be very practical, pragmatic, implement those strategies. And not, as sometimes happens in the European Union, that we have beautiful strategies, but no implementation on the ground. We need to make it happen. A new public-private partnership close partnership between the companies and the governments is needed. Flexible approach. And again, Northwestern Europe, I think, is uniquely positioned for this. I hope I wasn't too long, Jan, but these are my 2 cents.
Thank you very much. It was really nice setting the stage for the rest of the panel. Like yesterday, we will hear from all the speakers and then we will switch to discussion and your questions. So I now pass the words to Ulrich Benterbusch from German Ministry for Economic Affairs and Energy. Mr. Benterbusch, the floor is yours.
Yeah, many thanks, Jan. I do hope that you hear me. Is it okay?
Yeah, perfect.
Okay, great. Noe, you have, as always, ideally set the scene and the stage, because my kind of focus should be on implementation and the challenges, you know, that we face. So I will not dwell too much on our strategy as such. I mean, it's published almost a year now. It's known that we want 5 gigawatts of electrolyzers on German soil and that sort of thing. But where are the challenges for implementation? And there are, I think, 2 buzzwords that I would like to start with. One is support schemes. So in the essence, state aid. But even if we had, you know, all the financial resources that we would need, it would not be sufficient. We also need regulation. So the first message is that, you know, if we want to be successful in this space race that Noe has mentioned, how the Asian called it, then we need both support schemes, intelligent support schemes, and the right regulation. Now, when it comes to support schemes, you of course have to ask yourself the question, what are you going to support? And the most important aspect when it comes to the ramp up of the market, in my view, in our view, from the German perspective, and I'm pretty sure European colleagues will share that idea, we need integrated projects to start, you know, the ramp up of the market. What does this mean? We need to build up value chains for hydrogen, CO2-free, CO2-neutral, green, blue hydrogen. And that means that you have to have a spot where the hydrogen is produced. You need an installation, maybe an electrolyzer, okay. But of course, it does not make any sense, let's say somewhere in the north of Germany, just to produce hydrogen. You need also transport. So either you have a trailer or a system of trailers, or you have pipelines. And then you need a sector, a company who is going to use that hydrogen. And that you have to have on an integrated basis. And that kind of project we can support. But it does not make a lot of sense just to produce, support hydrogen. For that, we do have now in Germany a couple of billions. So the question of availability of funds is not just that simple, but we do have enough funds. So the question of financial resources is at the moment not the decisive bottleneck. I come to regulation a little bit later, but there's one important aspect that you need to be aware that as long as we are talking about industry, steel, chemicals, you know, we will also need OPEX support. So it will not be on a broader term. There is a special regulation which is different, RED II, but in general, you should have the idea that CAPEX support will not be sufficient. We will also need, on the demand side, an OPEX support. And that is, of course, a hard nut to crack, because OPEX support for industries, if you go to Brussels and discuss this with DG competition and rules on state aid, they will be very sensitive. But from our perception, from the German implementation viewpoint of hydrogen, it is imperative that we need OPEX support. It will not work, in our view, on a state basis in a lot of industrial applications without OpEx support schemes. With that, I would like to move on to certain types of projects where we think is a lot of value added, and that are the so-called important projects of common European interests. We have had our offer of sending us proposals that close on the 19th of February. And we are now selecting these kind of projects and reviewing them. We have had overwhelming interest. More than 160 project proposals were received. If you take those who are integrated, then it's a little bit less, but overall, it's a huge number. It adds up to, I think, round about 45 billion of investment. And of course, for that sum, there is no support scheme financed in Germany at the moment, but it only shows in a way how huge the interest in industry is. I mean, there are people sitting down designing projects that is also not for nothing. It costs money, you know, and they invest the time and effort to produce all these proposals. And of course, that's now not so easy as regards the management of expectations, but that's on a different page. What counts is there is a huge momentum also in other countries of the European Union for hydrogen. Now, we, of course, want also with this European approach integrated projects. That is at least a very interesting possibility, because we are deeply convinced that Germany can't do it alone. We need integration in Europe, and Europe as a whole needs to position itself for the production of hydrogen. And if we want to really use the global chances that are ahead of us, then we need to cooperate. And this framework of IPCEI projects, I think, is an excellent one. And I do hope that we will be successful with our partners in not only selecting, but also supporting the projects. But also here, as Europe is always complex, you should not expect that the respective go ahead and green light for these projects will be possible before the end of the year or early next year. But that is nothing special. That's the normal procedure. If you calculate the time necessary for the Commission then to decide at the end, that is what it's going to take. But I'm 100% sure these projects will come and they will have an impact on the market. Now, so much as regards to support schemes that I would like to share with you. And to sum up, two basic ideas: the notion of integration and the notion of CapEx and OpEx for many, many projects, where otherwise it will not fly. Now I will come to regulation, because regulation is also absolutely critical in order to be successful. The first regulation that we have been working on, the legislation on the Renewable Energy Directive 2 for the transport sector, that's something we have to implement based on the European respective directive. And that law has now passed our cabinet in early February. It's now in the notification process in Brussels. And once the notification in Brussels is done, I hope that happens now latest in April, the law is debated and dealt with in the Bundestag. And the idea is that before our parliament goes into holidays this summer, and then we have elections, we want to have that law passed by the Bundestag. What does this law foresee with regards to hydrogen? You know that the transport sector is one of the key sectors where we do see hydrogen. Noe just outlined this was industry and in particular transport, so heavy duty in particular, and of course air traffic as well. And what we have done is that in order for our, let's say, transport sector to reach its its CO2 reduction goals by 2030, we have designed a scheme that foresees that the percentage of renewable energies in the transport sector, used in the transport sector by 2030 is 28%. That is a huge percentage if you compare it with the data that we have now. We are now at, let's say, 4, 5, 6%. And it comes and adds up to a so-called climate change reduction, CO2 reduction quota of 22%. So in this mix of regulations, we have sub-quotas for green kerosene. So the green kerosene has now a secure market in Germany by 2030. And we have designed special incentive mechanisms through this huge quota for two things. For refineries to replace gray hydrogen by green hydrogen, because otherwise they are going to be penalized, and the money they have to pay if they get penalized is substantial. So there is an economic incentive now to go for green hydrogen in refineries. And we have a huge interest for car companies to use hydrogen to meet their quotas also in terms of CO2 reduction goals. So also for heavy duty traffic, we have now an incentive for the companies who produce fuels to offer green hydrogen or power to X fuels. And these are now mechanisms that will work because you can also import, it's open. And it's this area where we do think that maybe the first projects, we will need maybe a bit of CapEx support. But once the disadvantages of early movers are done, under the umbrella of the RED II, we do think that the maximum we need is CapEx support. And this is, when you take the German market, already very substantial, because if you add up the whole electrolyzer capacity that we will need to produce the necessary green hydrogen to replace gray hydrogen by green hydrogen in our refineries, you have round about 2 gigawatts of electrolyzers that you need. And as you may know, 5 is our target for 2030. So 40% we would, of course, already have only by the incentive via the RED II to replace the gray hydrogen by green hydrogen in refineries. So that is a very, very crucial regulation, which we have used to a very, very big extent, to incentivize the production of green hydrogen. Then I have to come to our renewable energy law, the EEG, because as you are aware, electricity is quite expensive in Germany. I think we are among the top 2 or 3 or even the most expensive electricity producer, at least for households. And that means that if you want to produce green hydrogen and use green electricity, we need to lower the input cost. And of course, the EEG surcharge is here critical. We have now 2 avenues where those who want to invest can go. One is the so-called special compensation scheme for energy-intensive industries. That can lead to a reduction of the EEG surcharge. That is a very, very short-term approach. And the second is that in the last reform of the EEG law, we have foreseen a directive that reduces the surcharge for electrolyzers on a legal basis. The first one that I mentioned is, on application basis, but that is not so legally secure. And therefore, we wanted to create more security for the industry. And that directive to reduce the surcharge for electrolyzers is at the moment being worked out. And we have promised to the coalition parties in the Bundestag that by the end of June, this directive will be in place. But that is not enough for those who want to produce green hydrogen to really start. Another very, very important aspect is the question of how do you control that you use green electricity? And in that context, we need still a delegated act from the Commission that is relatively complex because you have different criteria, like, for example, additionality, the correlation of production over time during a day, for example, or a week or a month, and the geographic correlation. I don't want to go into all the details here, but this is very critical because if this regulation in the Commission is done, let me be a bit, let's say now, rude, by eco-purists, then the benchmark is so high that the ramp up of the market will not really take off quickly. Therefore, at least from the Ministry of Economic and Energy in Germany, the wish, the mission, the statement is very clear. We need to be more flexible in the short run on this in order not to shoot ourselves, in the foot. And therefore, when it comes, of course, to geographic correlation, of course, in principle, in the north of Germany, that is better than in the south. But in the first years, we should not focus too much on these issues. And also with regard to the additionality criteria, we need also utmost flexibility. That is something that I would like to stress here as regards the delegated act, which is crucial. The next regulation that I want to touch upon is infrastructure, because without the respective regulation, of course, nobody will invest. In this context, there's one very critical discussion that we have to have also, not only nationally, but in Europe. And that is the question whether the hydrogen grid to be developed should be a regulated asset and fall under, let's say, the broad regulation that we have today for natural gas, or whether that is not possible. So in the essence, it means to resolve the question whether the clients, the customers of natural gas of today also have to put a little bit effort into, the basket to finance the hydrogen grid that is behind this question. There are arguments in favor of that, because if by 2050 natural gas has to be phased out, there will be a transition period where the grid costs for those who still use natural gas will be quite high. And we can argue that there is a transition period, where also the natural gas customers of today profit from investment in future hydrogen grids. But that's still something we need to discuss. For the moment and in the short term, since we have more or less production and consumption limited to a couple of clients in industry, we don't think in Germany that this is legally safe. So the natural gas customer of today, 21, 22, 23, we cannot ask him to finance hydrogen investment. That is why we develop a support scheme, and we will change the Energiewirtschaftsgesetz, the ENWG, in order to give legal certainty to those who want to reuse existing natural gas pipelines for hydrogen use. That legal proposal is now in the Bundestag and will be debated there and hopefully also decided upon by the end of June latest, so that the law will be in force before the Bundestag stops its activities because of our upcoming election in September. Because we regard this, of course, for the upcoming projects that we want to support as highly critical. Without any regulation on infrastructure, nobody will invest in infrastructure. And if there is no infrastructure, then there is no transport for hydrogen. If there is no support, there is no integrated project. Or you have to have trailers, and then basically I think you are in the transport sector. So that's as regards infrastructure. I want to mention one other thing, the carbon border adjustment mechanism, very, very briefly. This is a very, very hot issue. I don't want to go into the details here and the risks, WTO and all that stuff. I just want to mention that in order, for hydrogen to fly in Europe, you mentioned the steel industry. I don't think it's possible to fuel so many subsidies to companies like ThyssenKrupp or Salzgitter or ArcelorMittal, on the OPEX side, to make green hydrogen competitive vis-a-vis, let's say, coal today or even natural gas. So that assumes that some kind of border adjustment mechanism has to be developed, but that is a very, very tricky thing. And of course, in addition, that is just a buzzword here. I don't want to go into details here, but of course, we also, when it comes to international trade, need certificates, we need certification processes. So if you want to import green hydrogen or its derivatives, we have to have mechanisms that assure that these are produced by internationally agreed standards and are acknowledged globally. But since I did not focus here on global issues today in my presentation, I don't want to go into details here. With that, and also with a view to the time, I want to stop, but I hope I have conveyed to you a little bit a feeling that, the hydrogen business is not to come tomorrow. It will take some time, but we are actively working on both support schemes and the right regulation. And if both is done in the right manner, the ramp up of the market will come. Many, many thanks. And of course, I'm happy to answer any questions you may have later in the discussion.
Thank you very much. This was extremely informative regarding the implementation strategies that were highlighted in the first contribution. Now I pass the word to Jörg Kemmerzell from Technical University Darmstadt, who will speak some more about the ways these strategies can be implemented. Jörg?
Yes. Can you hear me?
Yeah. Good.
Okay, thank you. Can I share my screen?
Oh.
Can you see it?
Yes. Just please send it to the presentation mode and you're ready to go.
Yes. I will start from the beginning. Okay. Yes, thank you very much. And first of all, for giving me the opportunity to talk with a very distinguished panel. And I could say, okay, most things have been said. Maybe can the other participants turn down their microphones? I have here some feedback. That would be very nice. Yes, thank you. Okay. I will begin with my presentation. First of all, I'd like to shortly introduce our research team because this is not only my personal work, but as most of the time it's some kind of a collaborative work. We are part of a larger research consortium which is financed by the German Ministry of of Research and Education, and Michel Knott, of whom you're very good aware now. He is one of the principal investigators of the whole project, and our research team, that is me and my two colleagues, both named Christina. Okay. I will start with the content. Much of the interesting things have been said now, and I will skip, I think it also with view to the timetable, it might be useful and reasonable to skip my first top that would be on the significance of hydrogen and energy transitions. And I think in the morning, in the presentation from Mr. Rush, many things have been said on this. And in the remainder of my presentation, I will concentrate more a little bit on questions on issues of the hydrogen topic, which may be interesting also from or particular interesting from a political science perspective, because I think many of the attendants are should be or will be also from political science or from other social science disciplines. Okay, I will skip to the first part. Just a quick reminder, we have then framework, this European or the European Union hydrogen strategy, and this is a stepwise process with 3 steps. Until 2024, there should be an expansion of renewable hydrogen electrolyzers and a low carbon transition of the existing hydrogen production. Then there should be an really onset of installation 2 times 40 gigawatts. Renewable electrolyzers means 40 gigawatts in Europe and 40 gigawatts in the European neighborhoods. That means mainly in the southern and in the eastern neighborhood. And then after 2030, the outreach to the so-called hard to decarbonize sectors. Okay, I think it's a mixed bag approach up until now, and it's understandable, but now I will come to the hydrogen issue, not so much from the policy or from a techno-economic perspective, but also from a politics perspective, and will then put this in the larger multi-level governance framework. Which are the maybe also conflictual issues on hydrogen. And in Germany, there is some kind of debate going on. I called it a champagne or sparkling water strategy of hydrogen. And the champagne metaphor was coined, I think, from the German energy economist Claudia Kempfert. And she said, okay, this hydrogen is some kind of champagne of the energy transition. Champagne means it's a very rare and very expensive element. And on the other side, you have a notion of hydrogen, which you are maybe more aware of. Is this the new crude oil? There was, I think, at the end of last year or the beginning of this year, there was an article in the Energy Research and Social Science Journal, which asked exactly this: is hydrogen the new oil? And because of the nice mirroring of the metaphors, I choose the sparkling water metaphor. That means it is not the rare and expensive element which is only used on specific occasion, but it's more some kind of the basic feedstock of the energy transition or energy transitions in the future. The second conflict is around or is about the question which I coined green or multi colored. I think we talked about, or particularly Mr. Rush talked much about it in the morning session. Therefore, I will go very quickly through it. And the political questions about this issue will be, should there be a very strong preferential regulatory framework for green hydrogen, or should there be at least a temporarily equal treatment of different types of hydrogen that are in the end these two things, the green and the blue one, which is a kind of a blue. Okay, you have heard about it in the morning, therefore you know what the problem would be and what the question would be. The third conflict may arouse around the question, should we concentrate on some kind of domestic circular economy, or should there an import orientation? On the left picture you see what is called an e-farm, where there is, which is at the core of such regional circular value chain. There is electricity production from windmills, there will be electrolyzers and batteries, and there will also be fueling stations, for example, for buses and other vehicles driven by hydrogen or electrical engine or electric energy. The other picture you see, these are dromedaries in Morocco standing in the front of windmills, and this is I think a very good symbol for this the debates about the import strategy. Should we import, or how much hydrogen must be imported from neighboring regions? We heard in the presentations from Noel the self-image of Australia. We have the sun, and this is in a very similar way. This could be also applied, for example, to Northern Africa. Okay, now I will come to the let's say a little bit more theoretical debate about these approaches. And I think if we view the European system as a multi-level governance system, then there is one central or crucial question of multi-level governance is everywhere. Should we centralize, or should there be decentralization? Should there be policy homogeneity, or should there be heterogeneity? I have not the time to go to these these both variants, but there are particular or specific advantages and disadvantages of both strategy, and the advantages of one strategy are often mirrored in the disadvantages of the other. But what we can do at this point is that centralization and decentralization is not so much a matter of kind, but more a matter of degree, and that we could and should distinguish between policy issues and policy scope. If we, for example, if we turn to the infrastructure question or to the question of standardization and norms, then we get maybe different answers on the question how far and what should be centralized or decentralized. Then we turn to then for example, as we turn to the question of the proper production and application of hydrogen. Okay, now shortly a brief application of this multi-level governance question of centralization to the three political conflicts around hydrogen. Oh, sorry. Oh, no. My doorbell was ringing, but I think I will stay here with my presentation. The first thing is the champagne or sparkling water strategy. What implies this in regard to centralization or decentralization? I think this champagne's strategy implies a rather narrow and dense centralized regulatory framework, which makes particular points on the appropriate application of hydrogen. And the sparkling water strategy implies more a technology open, non-discriminatory framework. And if we turn to the advantages and disadvantages of both strategies, of both kinds of governance, then there is some kind of balancing. You have on the side of central governing strategy, for example, a centralized champagne strategy. The advantages might be you have stable expectations on the side of the actors, but the disadvantages might, for example, that the cost digression of a large scale rollout of hydrogen will be prevented, or that there will be unintended effects on infrastructure development, for example. And the same could be said on the decentral phase of governance. Okay, I come to the question of green or multicolored, and I will skip it. I think Minister Benterbusch has talked much about these instruments, and also he pointed to the conflict of the green or multicolored strategy. So that I can skip this point. Okay, I come to my last point. This is a question to domestic production or import orientation. There we'll start with an empirical observation. We have a regional variation of hydrogen strategies, and here I turn, for example, a brief example to the German states. You have at least three groups of states. You have the northern states, which see their role more as hydrogen producers and are very interested in the establishment of those regional circular economic clusters. Then you have maybe or mostly the Eastern Germans still a lignite producing stage, which the development of hydrogen economy as a support instrument for regional economic transitions. And then you have these southern states, which are where all the big industries are, where all the mechanical engineering tradition in Germany is mainly located, and they see themselves more as a kind of technology provider and also as consumers of hydrogen from what source, whatever. Okay, and this is a pattern, I think, which could be found on the European level as well. Okay, also here you have different, let me say, a very not so clear answer to the question centralized or decentralized, really differentiated answer. Okay, now I come to my conclusion. After this brief race through the politics and governance of hydrogen, what should we do? Is there a rule of thumb for decentralization, for centralization or decentralization? And I think a rule of thumb could be the question to first try to answer the question: are there beneficial spillover effects of centralization. And I think those spillover effects will be there in the case of infrastructure development and institutional development, if we have a broad understanding of institutions, which also include not only the networks, it means the grids, but also things like standard and norms. And on the other hand, what could central governance do? I think in the first phases of the European strategy, it should employ an enabling role for the expansion of the hydrogen economy while abstaining from too details, steering, which could also have unintended effects and could maybe have the problem to prevent developments which the actors all originally strive for. And the role of decentral governance is at least the adaptation of the instruments to the local requirement. That is what's called in theory the preference matching, but also I think to aim for coordination among the actors. Okay, my last 2 points. First, as I said before, the degree of centralization and decentralization should depend on the policy issues, and therefore we should have a differentiated view on this. And at least there are conditions within the hydrogen economy evolves or develops, and this what's there can only this is the point where I like to this is the point where I like to point to the talk of Mr. Rush from this morning. For example, if you like to roll out a green hydrogen strategy, you depend on factors like the expansion or a quicker expansion of renewables, and or for example the import of green hydrogen. And the best hydrogen strategy and the best regulatory frame would help if those necessary conditions aren't met. Okay, thank you, and I apologize for the doorbells.
Thank you, Jörg. No problem there.
This is the problem of the home office.
Yeah. Okay. And now I'm going to pass the word to Jorgo Chatzimarkakis from Hydrogen Europe, who is our final speaker, and will guide us through more details of Europe's hydrogen strategy and some additional details of the national strategies.
Many thanks, Jan, and I'm not sure whether you can see my screen.
Yes, we can see your screen.
Excellent.
Well. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you very much, and thanks for the opportunity also to present. And it's always good to see good old friends also as speakers like Noe and like Ulrich. Hydrogen Europe, you can see it here, is a European association, but covering upstream, midstream, and downstream. I think as of today, we have 257 members, and it's growing, I have to say, on a daily basis, which is very, very good. It shows that the sector is shaped, is being about to be shaped and grows together. And we have a lot of players, of course, from the hydrogen technologies like electrolyzers, fuel cells, but also automotive, maritime is getting more and more important. And of course, gas grids, power grids, it all comes together. Hydrogen has become systemic and real. It was real already for B2B business in some chemical applications. We have heard about that. But the most important point is that it has become systemic for the European Green Deal. It has become systemic for the achievements that Europe has promised under the Paris Agreement. And well, it has become a real factor in concrete projects, and that is new. Now, let me tell you what the challenges are in this year and in the years after. So first of all, and this was in August when the Energy Post made this, basically this title, who will be the hydrogen superpower, the EU or China? I would add after the elections in the US or the US, because we definitely can see that there is a global race on this new commodity, which is called or will be called clean hydrogen going on. So for the European Union, it has become a top priority. It started all, and Noé was witnessing it, it started all with the European Vice President Frans Timmermans, knowing the Netherlands very well, knowing, and I have to say that there are plenty of projects, of course, in Germany. I would say on a global scale, Germany with its 50 power to gas projects and its 110 fueling stations, hydrogen fueling stations, is a very, very implementing country. When it comes to the technology application on a very, very high scale, that's the Netherlands. Here you see clearly an advantage. However, Mrs. von der Leyen tweeted that clean hydrogen will help us reconcile our economy with the health of our planet. That's the spirit of the EU Green Deal. So I think in this one sentence, she brought together that it's something to reconcile basically economic and industrial development with climate protection. And yeah, we have seen a shift of the importance of hydrogen in the last year. The member states do support this idea. This year is the launching event of the IPCI. That is an abbreviation standing for Important Project of Common European Interest. Here you see the ministers of 23 member states, not all of them signed, but the vast majority signed. It's the declaration that these member states will endeavor an IPCI on hydrogen. We have already IPCIs on microelectronics, on batteries. They have been announced, the battery IPCIs have been announced quite recently. And this year is a very, very promising and important step. Why? Because the existing national hydrogen strategies in several countries with earmarked money will now, of course, find a tool basically to waive state aid rules. I'll come back to it. You see here that on the left-hand side that some of the member states have already adopted a clear hydrogen strategy. And you can also see that the earmarked money by countries like Germany, Spain, France, Portugal, one of the rising stars, maybe superstars, Austria and Italy, are altogether already 45 billion for the next 10 years. That's considerable because these hydrogen earmarked money will be part of the recovery and resilience plans that will be presented now and that need, well, first of all, the approval of the European Commission. And later on, and this is why this slide is so important, later on the approval of DG competition. So the competition rules, the state aid reform needs to go on. And here I have good news, maybe not for hardcore liberals, but Mrs. Margarete Vestager is herself a liberal. She took this photo here. You can see her on this photo, and she, well, she tweeted herself this nice photo that she made of herself. And I have the honor also to be there. So it was a great day. Why? Because she said clearly that she will waive the state aid rules during the next years, especially in the years 22 to 25. This is important because this gives us the opportunity basically to scale up with big pilots, with big demonstrators, in order to bring down the cost. So the champagne discussion that we just heard will become a Prosecco and later on a water discussion. So the price in these 3 years of especially renewably produced hydrogen is supposed to be to go down. And only after it makes sense to start with market tools. I come to them immediately, but the financial engineering that we need in order to scale up these projects and to bring down the costs will need some deep thought. The same applies to the projects that we are engineering at the moment, both in the IPCEI process and in the European Clean Hydrogen Alliance. You see in my back the logo of this European Clean Hydrogen Alliance. So there are different funds and different possibilities to really support financially these projects, to attract private financing, of course, in order to make this happen. But this is good for pilots and demonstrators. We have made bad experiences in the past. I allude to the solar market, when we did not have the right instruments for the market incentivation. This is what we would propose, and we will propose this paper, the Hydrogen Act, during a conference of the European presidency, 7th of April in Portugal, so the Portuguese presidency, where we would like to propose not all the solutions, but all the questions that we need to tackle when it comes to future hydrogen markets. One of them is the big part of the infrastructure, ownership questions, and of course, the creation of backbones. And on the other hand, the pure hydrogen market, how can this work? In this paper, I can already say we have 6 principles that are of utmost importance. First, hydrogen has developed from an innovative niche technology to a systemic element. We discussed that. Hydrogen plays a key role in delivering climate neutrality, which means it merits a dedicated framework. So this is clear, a dedicated framework for clean hydrogen. Third, there's a need for a certification scheme, which is trackable, traceable, transparent, transportable, and ultimately trustworthy. That's the 5 T's, and I'll present them back again, because this is something new. There are certification schemes for electricity. There are certification schemes for gas. We believe that hydrogen needs their own certification, not part of the electricity market, although some people would interpret it like that, not part of the gas market, although some people say it's a gas. Bracket, blended hydrogen should be under gas market rules, clean hydrogen not. 4th point is making hydrogen part of a smart energy system integration system means that it includes the use of ledger technologies. So what we say here is you need to have possibly, in order to make it transparent, this certification scheme, to use ledger technologies, possibly blockchain, not necessarily. But it should be a real transparent and fast market that develops there. The 5th point, different tools can be utilized to incentivize the market uptake and functioning on the production side and on the demand side. So we have on the production side quotas, feed-in tariffs that sometimes work, sometimes not. Some member states have made bad experience with them. But on the demand side, we see the rise of a new star, which is the contract for difference. And we have seen, Noé, I've seen that in the Netherlands, the Commission has supported, so DG Competition has supported a scheme for elements that entail contract for difference. That's important because that levelizes the cost for the consumer on the demand side. Just a very concrete example, take the biggest chemical company in the world, BASF. If they would change from gray hydrogen, and Ulrich alluded to it, to green hydrogen, they are consuming 2% of the global hydrogen production already. That's immense. That's a big volume. and the extra price is also immense. And that is why a contract for difference could help BASF to take immediately the decision, yes, we go there. At the same time, you help, of course, the producers. The last principle here is the Hydrogen Act should contribute to framing Hydrogen Europe's replacement strategy of fossil carriers. So you can replace gray hydrogen, but also gas, coal and oil, coal in the steel sector. I think I would like to come back to these 5 T's when it comes to this certification scheme, the guarantees of origin that should be aligned to that should be tagged basically on every ton of hydrogen. So these guarantees should be trackable and traceable. And we have a nice instrument already developed over the last years, which is called certify with HY in the end. However, this is much to a high threshold, I have to say. The Commission will present 21st of April a threshold of the cleanliness of hydrogen, so the content of CO2 that it may have in order to qualify for clean hydrogen in the taxonomy regulation. It should be transparent, tradable, and trustworthy. And then it's good to go. And this was my presentation. We believe that these 3 years of implementation of these demonstrators will be the most important step in order to create a cheaper and acceptable, socially acceptable basis for a hydrogen market. Thanks very much indeed.
Thank you very much. Thank you for this presentation. I now open floor to the discussion. I dare to kick off the first question to whoever from the panel. We spoke a lot about developing new industries and about the economics of it. And I would like to briefly move towards the political economy of hydrogen fuel supply chains. Can you elaborate a little bit on where the added value mostly lies in the supply chain? How can Europe or European companies make sure to get their hands on that part of the chain?
Maybe one short answer. In the end, I mean, it's an endeavor that will also see where is the biggest bang for the buck. So our experience shows the biggest bang for the buck you get in steel. So the biggest amount of abatement of CO2, because that's the currency in which we will deal with. That's CO2. However, there will be special markets that will develop and they all depend on the regulation. What kind of regulation do we have in the mobility of cars, in maritime sector? So I believe that ammonia will become one of the most important carriers of or derivatives of hydrogen being used in the maritime sector. And if you concentrate today on ammonia, you can be a very rich company in the next 5 to 10 years. But it all depends on the regulation for the maritime sector. And that is why if you ask biggest bang for the buck, steel, but it takes some time. If you ask immediate success, chemical, petrochemical, fertilizer, immediate success. So it will be a very mixed answer. It's very difficult to say this clearly for one single market.
Yeah, maybe just to add, I mean, I agree with what Jorgo was saying. But I think you can see, Jan, I think you can see where is Europe focusing. So if you look at the global picture, what I sense is that Europe is actually is kind of ahead of the game globally when we talk about indeed these industrial applications. I think we are doing much more and much more interesting, innovative projects on steel, on refineries, etc., and also heavy-duty transportation than, for instance, Asia. So Asia is more on the car side, more on transportation, but also light vehicles, and more on the power sector, relatively speaking, where they are also quite innovative. So I think, again, if we manage to be ahead of the game and provide innovative solutions in the industrial side, on heavy duty transportation, on seasonal storage, on long seasonal storage kind of thing, then I mean all these companies that are basically working on these kind of things in the entire value chain, because it's much bigger than many people see, can be extremely helpful and can be extremely, and offshore wind I mentioned. So I mean, think about if we manage in Europe to be the innovative companies that do offshore electrolysis on a large scale, I mean that the whole world will turn there eventually. So there are so many opportunities. It's hard to capture in one or two sentences.
Jan, in addition, I would say, you know, from a, let's say, viewpoint of a ministry, we do have to take, of course, into account the question of cost. And it means that, of course, if you take green hydrogen, it's today rather costly. So one big issue is to get the cost curve down as soon as possible. And in order to do that, and that is where I see, you know, steel, not today, but maybe later. We have to select those applications where the cost difference today is comparatively low, so that the support need is also comparatively small. And that, of course, is an aspect that speaks in favor of the transport sector, because here also the readiness to pay is relatively high. But of course, at the same time, we should not forget the industrial sectors and its application. And therefore, of course, we will also support these kind of projects. But overall, to get things done quickly, we have to have a regulation that produces bankable projects. Yeah, that is something we need. And therefore, we have focused so much on the RED II regulation, and I kind of focused so much on the RED II application, because that offers that kind of framework. And if that is done in different European countries in the same spirit, then we have already economies of scale. And that will help a lot the producers, and of course also the transport question, because here we do need European regulation. I want to stress that as well, because if the refinancing mechanism, you know, is kind of harmonized in a European regulation for hydrogen grids and offers, let's say, relatively practicable and easy way for those who invest in infrastructure, that will have a big impact in conjunction with, you know, the right regulation for let's say, investment, be it RED II or other areas.
Can I jump in here another time? Because wonderful. What Ulrich just said is extremely valuable, and it's the basis. But I would like to dive one step deeper in RED II and in one principle that shows how you can make a good regulation or how you can make it super crappy. So that's the principle of additionality. So I explain what it says. RED II, that some wise people did 5 years ago, it was in the trilogue, foresees that in order, you can do whatever you want with green electricity, do whatever you want, except one thing, hydrogen. You cannot produce hydrogen unless you have an additional capacity. This is absolutely not an invitation for any investor to go into that market, and it's utter crap, to be clear. So, and I really criticize that. However, we saw the leak of the European Commission of how this RED II, Renewable Energy Directive, should be implemented in May, delegated act. To be honest, when a leak comes so early, it seems that it should not be implemented. So it should not be like that. Additionality should be out. And this is for us extremely important. Ulrich, I'm fully aware of the situation in Germany, where the Bundesumweltministerium possibly sticks to additionality. And I can understand that your ministry has an issue with that, because you see the investor side. I can only say that in the meanwhile, even the Commission is very critical and asks members of parliament to have in their internal debate a ban for this additionality. it's easy to do. You put the baseline just behind. You can easily change this, but we need to overcome this idea, religious idea, that it's all about green electricity. No, it's about bringing both together. It's about helping green electricity basically to be stored, to be used. Germany had last year, Ulrich, you know that, a curtailment of 1.5 billion, but that's not it. It had a balancing cost of 30.5 billion. 30.5, so 32 billion just to prioritize green electricity and not to balance it. Hydrogen could do it. So here you see why this additionality does not make any sense. And I am attacked by NGOs because I'm against additionality, as if it would be a crime to be helpful. I'm very sorry to say so, because sometimes, put NGO on your face and you can say whatever. Sorry. That's a big thing. Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much. We have a couple of related questions in the chat. First, ask about what does it take to convert the existing infrastructure, gas infrastructure, to hydrogen, and how about regulating it? And then there are two questions about different national approaches. What are the challenges that separate Germany from other countries in Europe or themselves from each other? And how about prioritizing green hydrogen over the other types of hydrogen? And what do you expect to be the economics of those diverging priorities?
Can I make it short? I try to make it big. It's a lot of questions. So yeah. Repurposing a hydrogen pipeline, repurposing is 25% of the cost of a new pipeline. Mm-hmm. So, and it depends of how much you do. I think in Germany, Ulrich, correct me if I'm wrong, the prediction, and Germany is in the center of the continent, is about 6 billion for a backbone, a big backbone, 6 billion. That's something, yeah, it's costs. But if you see that you can transport renewable energy 10 to 20 times cheaper via a molecule compared to an electron, and you cannot build up power infrastructure, it makes sense. What is the regulatory approach to get there? 10E. So the 10E regulation is the basis of how this can be repurposed. And we are extremely pleased to see that the Commission in their proposal took out one category. There were 4 categories. So electricity, oil, gas, and CO2. They took out oil, and they presented 2 new categories, hydrogen and power to gas, which is hydrogen. So super happy, it goes in the right direction. How to prioritize green? Well, that's what everybody talks about. Me, I'm a colorblind guy, so I can tell you that there is a lot of hydrogen that may come from pyrolysis, so turquoise hydrogen, which is 5 times cheaper than electrolysis hydrogen, but the technology is not mature. Or what about this Russian or Mali or Ukrainian white hydrogen, natural hydrogen? So colors are not the point. What is the point is the carbon content. And this threshold will be presented 21st of April, will decide about this. If you're above the threshold, don't invest into this technology. So if you only achieve 60%, it is about 80% of decarbonization. So that's the prediction that we see. If you don't achieve that, you should not invest into it.
Let me make one additional point on this issue of the infrastructure and repurposing of the gas pipelines, because I mean I agree with everything that Jorgo said as usual, but this issue of really a proactive approach of repurposing the gas pipelines in Europe, I mean, it's kind of ahead of the game. That is going to define, in my view, are we able to create this integrated European market? Or, and I'm very grateful for Jörg to bring this wonderful story of the champagne to the discussion, because that champagne approach of hydrogen, in my view, is very dangerous, because that means It's going to be only, you know, in some select corners. You don't need any infrastructure. Then we are not going to have an integrated European market. And if we are not willing to do that, and if we don't dare to kind of take the risk a little bit as collective governments to say, no, we need to create this market, then we don't get Ulrich's integrated value chain. And this is what we need. Then we get only in selected, you know, in some port areas, you have some hydrogen, some refineries that do some stuff. That's never going to work. It's going to be slow. And it's going to be not an integrated market where you get the cost down very rapidly and you can transport the hydrogen across Europe.
Yeah. I would like to add, Noe, you know, and in addition, then we would follow a path of deindustrialization.
Exactly.
That is what is at stake in my view.
Yeah.
You only have to take a ship and go from the Netherlands down the Rhine. And then you see all the chemical plants, you know, in Leverkusen, in Dormagen, runter nach Karlsruhe, you know. So there's so many chemical plants, big chemical plants. They are not by chance along the Rhine. That has some reasons. But we will lose all that if we are not able to fuel the necessary CO2-free hydrogen to these plants in the future. Exactly. Just to give you one example.
Exactly.
What is at stake?
Yeah, hydrogen is strategy for Europe is survival for European industry. It's as simple as that.
Jörg, you wanted to say?
Okay, I would like to make a short, more general remark on the question of what are the proper regulatory issues. And though I would like to remember that we are not talking about an efficient market that is still in place and that has to be regulated. We are not so much concerned with policies to regulate efficient markets, but with innovation policy. It's still at the stage of innovation, and therefore I would say the rationality of innovation policy is always to get to scale up things to come from this stage of development to the stage of a large scale application. And I think that the instruments applied in the innovation stage are different from those instruments which could be applied to efficient markets.
Thank you. I might have, if there's nobody with raised hand or another chat question, I might have one more. If
Jan,
yes,
sorry to say, I have to move out because I have the next appointment, and I think we agreed that by 1 or so, you know.
Yeah. I know, but I always tend to prolong things I consider interesting.
So
Thank you very much for being here.
Thanks a lot.
It was interesting to join your panel and to see the colleagues, Jorgo and Noe and Jörg. So I wish you a very good, let's say, discussion, and bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you very much for being here.
Thank you.
Ciao.
Ciao.
So as for the rest of the panel, of course, we are 7 minutes past our deadline, so feel free to sign out. And for the participants, let me remind you of tomorrow's poster and paper session. We will have 3 interesting presentations that will be nice to follow, but also come anybody who is interested in developing research projects on the topics that we have covered. So we can have discussion over where to go next with them. Now, if our speakers still have a couple of minutes.
Depends on the question. So if there's a question,
yeah. If it's terrible question, just sign off immediately, and I will understand what you mean by that, and then I will go to my room and think about that. So now there's a bigger pressure on me. Okay, I just forgot the question. Now I wanted to ask. We have seen that from the sheer complexity of what we have discussed today, and as well as tomorrow, like how many things have to, come to place at a relatively short time, at very, precise stage of things, piling up on top of each other. as a person who followed a bit processes of developing new sectors and new industries, there's a lot of points of being reasons to be pessimistic about the goals that we have and about our ability to reach them. From your perspective, what are the reasons to be optimistic about us being able to do all that stuff that we have just outlined in previous 90 minutes?
If you allow, Noe and Jörg, I would like to give a short answer, and then, as I have another meeting, indeed, I would then say goodbye. So I think the most important thing was definitely to bring it up on a political agenda, on the highest political agenda that is possible in Europe. Why? Because this hydrogen champagne, and which develops to Prosecco and water, needs a lot of money. We need a lot of money. Noe doesn't like it. He's Dutch. He doesn't want to talk about money, I know. But we need to agree all together as Europeans that, and you said that, Noe, and Ulrich said it, we lose our industrial basis if we don't do this disruptive change. And this change, if you go from a horse to a car, it needs a new infrastructure. It needs a lot of investment. And that's the most important thing, to have an agreement. Yes, it's worth it. And I think we are there. It took us years, but as of last July, there is a consensus which, with the hydrogen strategy on the European level, which was backed by the member states. So don't forget, the member states at their last summit in December, they issued a 14 pages paper. Ulrich was one of the authors, which fully subscribes to this hydrogen strategy. That's the most important point. Now I'm under stress, permanent stress, to build these projects. And we will achieve until end of May, the first draft of a project pipeline encompassing all the 6 parts of the value chain. So production, dissemination, end use and industry, mobility, buildings, and energy system. And we are now building these projects. We have a lot of data. We have a lot of projects that we know, but we need to engineer them together. This is at the moment what we need to do. At the same time, of course, discussing with DG Com. And that is what makes me very, very optimistic. Having a look and having seen how many projects we have proposed, I'm extremely optimistic. However, we might need at a certain stage more patience than we showed it in the solar business. In the solar business, we stepped out publicly, then private investors were out, and now the thing is in China. And I don't even want to start with battery, where we need to win it back, if ever. In hydrogen, it's like Noah said, we are global leaders or co-leaders, and we can bring this forward. Maybe my last word is, my dream is that Rotterdam will become the central hub, the central marketplace of clean hydrogen globally. At the moment, you have in Rotterdam already, in the port of Rotterdam, 50 applications. Well, at the same time, Rotterdam is a bit less than 1/3 of the CO2 emissions of the whole country, of the whole Netherlands. If we succeed in this hot spot, so to say, to make it happen, this will become the trading point and the biggest and most important place to trade hydrogen, of course, denominated in euro and not in any other currency. Thanks very much. Happy to answer all your questions. I'm an optimist.
Yes.
And we will make it. Bye.
Thank you so much.
Bye. Bye. Okay. Well, I can only say I agree, Jan, with what Jorgo was saying. And I think, to add to that, I think the reasons to be optimistic is simply what we discussed many times now already, is the big momentum, and it's not only governments, it's also regions and industries. So that are really and not to forget the financial sector. So the financial sector is also increasingly pushing, all of these industries, the pension funds, the what have you, active investment funds, pushing them all, named BlackRock and what have you, saying, you guys need to get your act together. You need to be part of the solution. You need to move to zero emissions, and the investors are also ready to chip in and to provide the necessary funding. So yeah, there is no It's not going to be easy, but nobody said it was going to be easy, the energy transition. But we have no alternative. We need to make it happen, and I think the momentum is there. So like Jorgo, I'm also optimistic.
Thank you very much.
You need I think you need someone with a pessimistic view.
No,
I
don't.
Because if we ask, there's some. Should I also?
Go ahead. Yeah, please
add some thoughts on the optimistic path. I think there. I don't want to make an optimistic or pessimistic view. It's a functional view, and if I see no really alternative to the development of a hydrogen economy, if really this carbon zero goal is taken seriously, and this is, I think, this is the main point to be optimistic on this. But we have seen there are many obstacles. But if we ask what are the alternatives, I don't see them, and or there will be alternatives which are very conflict-laden, like global comeback of nuclear power. I think that would be possible in some countries, and in other countries, especially in European countries like Germany, I think that would be a no-go, and I think it would be a really conflict-laden issue, and therefore I think this green hydrogen strategy is at the moment the only realistic option to arrive at this nearly zero carbon goal at 2050.
Thank you very much.